I'm not scared of the dark, but I'm not ashamed to admit I don't like it. It makes me uneasy, like I'm being watched by someone whose gaze I can't see. Think the weirdo who wears sunglasses indoors, or the figure standing beyond frosted glass. The feeling is fairly common amongst adults, but it's damn near universal for children, except they externalize this fear through phantom boogeymen or monsters hiding in their closet. But the feeling actually stems from something innate, a primal essence crystallized within us to keep us from endangering ourselves. But in video games, I'm all about that danger, which is why I love me some dark atmospheric horror. Where other genres want players to engage in power fantasies, horror expects the player to be cool, letting go of the wheel and going along with the ride. And the ride is usually a headlong careen into someplace dark, full of terrors and nopes. It's disempowerment, and some of the best entries in the genre have found ways of exploring this disempowerment through the horror mainstay, darkness. It may seem like common sense, but not all horror games are created equal. Making a good one isn't as easy as flipping off the light switch. There's a certain je ne sais quoi which separates the meh from the great. I'd like to take time to explore 2 games which do just this. Specifically, how these games systemize darkness as a mechanic, and how they articulate it differently. Much of our understanding of modern horror comes from cinema, so it makes sense that Outlast's core scare tactic would emulate a staple of modern horror, the found footage film. It's an oversaturated subgenre, a byproduct of it being so cheap to produce, but in the context of gaming, Outlast was the first of its kind, and it felt surprisingly fresh when it was released back in 2013, mainly because it used darkness as a vehicle to explore the subgenre's most novel gimmick, the camcorder. Like with many found footage protagonists, Outlast's main character, Miles Upshur, is attached to his camera at the hip. One of the major criticisms of the subgenre is that no one in their right mind would continue holding onto a camera when a ghoul or raving lunatic is trying to carve their face open like a jack-o'-lantern. It's a valid critique, one that Outlast smartly avoids by making the camcorder vital to your survival. You see, Mount Massive Asylum, the game's central locale, is a dark place, both literally and figuratively. There are monsters within, murderous inmates who want nothing more than to penetrate Miles with something sharp or pointy or worse. Penis. I'm talking penis here, guys. Every dark corridor and hallway hides a potential encounter, yet Outlast makes it explicitly clear that the darkness isn't your enemy. In fact, it's something Miles must learn to exploit if he hopes to survive. Though you'd be forgiving for feeling otherwise, darkness is oppressive, it's all-encompassing, stirring up feelings of anxiety in us, and we have evolution to thank for this. The dark is the unknown, and we've been conditioned to fear it since the dawn of our species. It's a defense mechanism, an evolutionary advantage which ensured that our early ancestors didn't go wandering about the African plains at night. While modern Homo sapiens might be able to call themselves apex predators, that's only a recent development. We've actually resided closer to the bottom of the food chain for most of our existence. More often than not, early man found themselves at the mercy of creatures far bigger and stronger than us. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, wolf dogs, man-bear pig. If it had maws and fangs, chances are it had a taste for man flesh, which instilled the fear of the dark into our subconscious, because many of these creatures preferred to hunt at night. Nyctophobia is the fear of the dark, and it manifests itself in many ways. The most extreme and least common being panic attacks, insomnia, and even a detachment from reality and death. The more common response is a foreboding sense of anxiety, which might explain why many people have no love for survival horror. Video game or not, anxiety can cause some very real and very unpleasant physical responses. Breathlessness, sweating, shaking, heart palpitations. It's calling back to a primal emotion that's been ingrained in our psyche to protect us. No wonder I can't get my brother-in-law to play these games.
That's where we're going. Where?
In the vent.
Oh, fuck. There?
Yeah.
Yo, there's no shot. You couldn't pay me to go there, even in a video game.
You have to do it, Tom.
Who the fuck sees this and is like, oh, that's it. Yo, there's no. I was gonna try to curl up right here and just wait for someone to get me out of here.
3 hours later.
I got feeling like toying with me.
What do you expect to see?
It's a difficult feeling to overcome, especially when a game expects you to not only traipse willingly into the dark, but to be cool with having your head ripped off time and time again. As sadistic as Outlast is, it gives you all the tools you need to surmount that fear. The sickly green of night vision has been part of the found footage subgenre since the beginning. While watching found footage films has become an exercise in narrative contrivances, playing through a found footage film is harrowing, due in part to the game's use of darkness. You circumnavigate pursuers by keeping to the shadows, using your camcorder's night vision to light your way. Problem is, doing so drains your battery quickly, and batteries are a finite resource. Worse, you can only hold a handful at a time. It doesn't make any sense. It's not like Miles is walking around in a skin-tight leotard. He's got pockets, for crying out loud. But it's an effective means of gamifying the core gameplay conceit. Much of Outlast's tension comes from the fear of running out of that resource, being left to wander the dark with no clue where to go, or what you might run into. Outlast is a mechanically sparse game. You run, hide, and record. Aside from some other contextual actions, that's really all you do. While much has been said about the merits of the defenseless protagonist, this terse approach to design allows for Outlast to explore the relationship between darkness and the player. Initially framed as something to be feared, Outlast actually treats the dark as something to be allied with. It wants you to embrace it, to use it to your advantage. While you can't see your pursuers in the pitch black, that also means they can't see you. When being pursued, you're encouraged to hide inside lockers, but it's often more advantageous to just nestle yourself into a shadowy corner and wait for your tormentors to pass you by. The night vision allows you to steal glimpses of your would-be murderers. There's a voyeuristic pleasure that comes from knowing you can see them, but they can't see you. It's the closest thing Outlast has to empowerment. Yet, Red Barrel, the developer, finds ways of limiting this feeling by betraying the players' reliance on the camera. The camcorder is a crutch, and it's a crutch you're eventually forced to do without, as Miles loses it about 3/4 of the way through the game. It's only temporary, probably amounting to no more than 10 minutes of time, but it's the tensest 10 minutes Outlast has to offer. It's a mechanical articulation of separation anxiety, and it works incredibly well. Having to navigate dark corridors, contending with jump scares, the sequence is ripe with foreboding. What's most impressive is how attached you grow to the camcorder in the hours leading up to this moment. It unconsciously becomes an extension of your body, something you no longer recognize or notice as an external. So when you're inevitably separated from it, it's more daunting than when Miles loses actual body parts. For one, it genuinely feels like a handicap. Sure, it's a narrative contrivance, but Outlast has spent hours earning and justifying that contrivance. That time investment is what separates it from the more mediocre entries in the found footage subgenre. Losing the camera ends up feeling like a cruel joke, or violation, such as when a game puts an enemy into a safe room or hub area. It's supposed to be hallowed ground, a sacred untouchable that game designers usually don't betray. The few instances they do, it tends to work, because the violation of trust is an effective way of recontextualizing the mechanics in game space. Outlast is no different. The developers even go so far as to permanently damage the camera screen to heighten player discomfort. It doesn't provide a mechanical handicap, but a psychological one, which in a game as short as Outlast feels more than appropriate. There's even a bit of poetic irony to it. Miles gets horribly disfigured during his sojourn to Mount Massive. It seems only fair that his camera should too. Outlast's exploration of darkness is good. It's by no means revolutionary, but it's a little more considered than many of the game's detractors give it credit for. Its indulgence on body horror and jump scares isn't for everyone, and that's okay. It often just feels like a haunted house attraction. But it articulates the relationship between the player and darkness in a way that not only taxes resources, but also offers some iota of empowerment. Contrast this with Amnesia: The Dark Descent, where Outlast riffs on the tropes of modern horror cinema. The Dark Descent takes its cues from literature, specifically H.P. Lovecraft. Not only are there textual and thematic homages to his iconic brand of cosmic horror, but there are mechanical ones as well. One of the many resources you'll have to manage is your sanity, something most Lovecraftian characters lose in their brushes with the great old ones. The Dark Descent's main protagonist, Daniel, fares a little better than Lovecraft's characters, but his journey is no less harrowing. He's being hunted by something called the Shadow, a cosmic force with an unfortunate placeholder name. Castle Brennenburg, where the Dark Descent story takes place, is being encroached upon by this shadow, which not only fills the world with eldritch monstrosities, but an ever-expanding darkness that seeks to claim Daniel. As one would expect, it's quite taxing on him, and developer Frictional Games does everything they can to systemize this through gameplay. And man, did they nail it. In Outlast, the Dark was an ally that offered a limited amount of empowerment. Yes, using your camera's night vision was a drain on your resources, but it was a straightforward system with no real complexity and a fair amount of wiggle room. Running out of batteries? Just die or reload the game and you'll respawn with a full bar. The Dark Descent, on the other hand, weaponizes the dark. Daniel suffers from nyctophobia. Just being in it, even for a few seconds, causes him to grow anxious, which results with his sanity dropping. Consequently, he'll be stricken with panic attacks, which manifest through sensory and auditory responses. The camera will sway back and forth, as if standing in the hold of some creaky schooner. he'll begin seeing cockroaches. He'll even be racked by uncontrollable shaking. While Outlast sought to evoke anxiety in the player, the Dark Descent aims to do so in the player and the character. It's an effective way of putting gamers in Daniel's shoes. They had already accomplished this by making actions like opening doors and turning cranks feel like physical actions. Daniel's response to fear just hammers that principle home. Yet, the Dark Descent doesn't stop there. Like in Outlast, you can't mount an offensive against the creatures. You can only hide, which means you're stuck cowering in dark corners to avoid detection. But Daniel freaks out whenever he's in the dark. The core conceit of the game involves balancing two resources which can never truly be balanced. If you're safe, your sanity's at risk. If you're mentally sound, you're in danger of being mauled by some hideous beast. The interplay between these mechanics is remarkably elegant, and the Dark Descent is at its best when it pits these systems against each other. Much how Outlast capitalized on the strengths of the found footage subgenre, the Dark Descent heralds one of Lovecraft's most enduring narrative tropes, the limitation of the human mind. Lovecraft once said, "The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents." It's a flowery way of saying ignorance is bliss. Lovecraft believed that there are some things best left unknown. The mind has limits, and knowing what those limits are is in our best interests. I'm not referring to extra-dimensional creatures from outside space either. I'm talking the unknowables, things that our minds reject and can't make sense of. For instance, death. Not an afterlife, just death. Try to envision being dead. You can't. Your mind recoils at the idea. You might imagine an infinite sleep, an endless blackness, but that's still something, which from a secular perspective on death is incorrect. Death is a state of non-existence, and the brain can't parse that. It's a true unknowable. Even trying to quantify something like the size of the known universe, hell, even our galaxy, is a challenge. Sure, we can mathematically scale it, but good luck trying to visualize it. Our frame of reference is just too limited. Keeping in the spirit of its muse, the Dark Descent goes out of its way to establish the smallness and fragility of humanity through Daniel, the proxy. There's a reason why men don't fare well in Lovecraft's stories. Something most adaptations seem to forget, or misinterpret, is that Lovecraft often writes humans as insignificant and of little consequence to his pantheon of elder gods. The Dark Descent is probably one of the most faithful expressions of this style of horror. The elder gods aren't necessarily evil, but driven by a purpose. The shadow which hounds Daniel is a shade of this idea, and in true Lovecraftian fashion, it cannot be defeated. Neither can its agents, which is why Daniel's only hope is to overcome his fears. But he's his own worst enemy. Remaining in the dark causes anxiety, which decreases sanity, but so does looking at the monsters. In his panic, Daniel will begin to make noise, heavy breathing, shattering teeth, which will draw the creatures to him. So the only way to remain safe is to avoid looking at them entirely, to keep Daniel and the player in the dark as to the whereabouts and proximity of his pursuers. The Dark Descent might be the most mechanically sound game in all of survival horror. Every system and play is working with each other, moving towards a singular goal. Even when they're designed to be at odds with one another, there's a symbiosis that's contributing to the game's sense of tension and dread. The Dark Descent's systemic, slow-burning approach to horror is damn near perfect. It's cerebral, it's well-designed, and it does an incredible job mechanizing the anxiety of a nyctophobiac, which is probably why The Dark Descent isn't a game that needed a sequel. Add something or take something away, and the system just falls apart. So long as our fear of the dark remains, these games will continue to be effective. Be thankful for it. It's why we've lasted as long as we have as a species. It inspires dread, which kept us from making reckless decisions. Nowadays, it exists mostly in our heads, but it's survived by an entertainment medium that knows how to capitalize on it. So, the next time you stare into the dark maw of the unknown, try not to forget. It may be staring back. I won't blame you if you walk away. But if you make it through to the other side, congratulations. You, me, and countless others will be right there with you, gasping a sigh of relief. Thanks for watching.